All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. We do educational videos here, and we check into great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, cosmologies, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries. Most of them coming from obscure sources, and this is video 216 on the unit we're calling Reciprocal Church, which is where we are trying to amass weapons of mass creation. Great syncretic process of putting together a spiritual arsenal for yourself so that you can use these things in your own life, things that you actually can believe in, especially as we recognize that our Western religions are not believable as they become debunked through various means. But we're looking in particular at the New Testament today. Now, some of the other resources we've already talked about in the earlier videos, deep meditation to get into exotic states of consciousness, entheogens, we'll be doing more on that, ecstatic music, endurance, extreme endurance exercise, sacred geometry and mathematics, we'll be getting into a lot of that, and the reciprocal system of theory, which provides a kind of a bridge between science and religion. And so we're putting together these resources, but also deconstructing the old religions. And we are on the Christianity section, or the New Testament. We'll be getting to the Old Testament later. We've talked about Islam a little bit. It's in the same boat as the New Testament here. But basically, if you do the deep dive, even 6 inches deep, you realize that the New Testament was written by the Romans, the Caesars, the Imperial Romans in the late 1st century, during the reigns of Vespasian and Titus, and then after that as well, probably by a guy named Arius Piso and his family. He was an in-law, or he was related to Vespasian and Titus, but he basically served as kind of the closet emperor, or the secret emperor behind the scenes. And he wrote these Gospels, and then members of his family wrote a lot of the other the entire rest of the New Testament, including Pliny the Younger, who was his foster brother. He wrote all the epistles of Paul, or at least most of the epistles of Paul. They wrote them as plays, and so they had acts, and they wrote themselves into the plays. So Piso wrote himself in as Jesus, and also Joseph. He wrote his kids in as the apostles. He wrote Pliny in as Paul. He also played the role of Peter after the resurrection. And they would enact these plays. They would travel around and enact these plays in front of the ignorant masses who didn't know how to read, and so it didn't do that much good to write these things down, when very few people knew how to read. So they had to kind of get these things out there some way, and they used this theater idea. And that took over even more after this, where they developed kind of like what you would call P.T. Barnum type of techniques to draw people into their performances. And they also, I believe, kind of used the old pagan altars as temples in trying to develop Christianity, which was kind of a failure in the early years. this is all kind of according to Roman Piso, a little bit of Abelard Rushland thrown in, but also along the same lines as Joseph Atwill and Michael Maniscalco, which we're going to be getting to here today. But they had all kinds of technologies back then that you might not think. He had like a coin-operated kind of turnstile thing to get into the church, and they had the whole church rigged up with all kinds of tricks that are kind of tricks of pneumatics and water that made it look like God was actually there, because there was all kinds of, what you would call action at a distance, where something would happen, but you didn't see the source of it. So it looked like magic. So, they really believed that it was like a house of God. The ignorant masses were very much affected by some of this stuff because they didn't know the science behind it. So it was kind of Barnum-esque in that way. But we're looking at now this guy Arius Piso, who wrote the Gospels, was also known as Josephus, and so he wrote the Wars of the Jews. Josephus is actually the only author other than the Gospels to have mentioned the name of, or to corroborate Jesus' existence in the first century. So that kind of eliminates him as a credible source. But also, he's already eliminated as a credible source just by reading his autobiography, where you recognize that he was the adopted son of Emperor Vespasian, and he lived at the court of the Caesars for this entire time that he was writing Wars of the Jews. So he wasn't it's not history, it's propaganda. They were fighting a war against the Jews. Not just the 66 to 73 war, but the overall, it was a war that had been going on since, 125, 150 years before that. So that's what the Gospels were for. They were wartime propaganda in order to mellow out the Jews and hopefully, teach them to worship a Prince of Peace who believed in turning the other cheek and rendering unto Caesar's what was Caesar's. So now Maniscalco, what he does in the book that we're looking at here today, his book called Christianity's Origins, he maps out a graph between, this is the book of Luke, 24 chapters. So, you go up as you go up in chapter. And then this is Wars of the Jews by Josephus or Arius Piso. And it's got 700 paragraphs or thereabouts. And he maps them out. And so every time there's a parallel between them, you put a dot there. And so that shows you how many parallels there are, or it starts to show you how many parallels there are between the work of Josephus and the Gospels. To the extent where they had to have been written by the same entities, which was the Piso family. Okay, so we're going to take over here. We're on like page 11, where he just got done going through this rather fascinating parallel of both Jesus and Titus, the military general who eventually became the emperor of Rome, and their campaign, Jesus's church, his ministry, and Titus's military campaign, and the parallels between it, but especially here at the Lake of Galilee, Sea of Galilee, that there are just a ton of fairly detailed or specific parallels, but also that you could definitely read those passages 442 to 452, paragraphs 442 to 452, and Josephus, and Luke chapter 4, verse 40 through verse 5. And you could read them together and not really see the parallels, but if you unpack it, you unpack about 8 or 10 things that are actually pretty darn specific. So that's what the last point that he made was, you have to marvel at he says, amazing for how detailed it is, but also for how carefully hidden it is. Many of these parallels were first described by Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah, but I will now arrange the two relevant sections of texts, heavily abridged to be readable, from Luke and Wars of the Jews, or Jewish War, side by side, by highlighting parallel text in matching color. This will help guide the reader's eye to identify and appreciate the parallels that are there. For some reason, that doesn't really help me, and I think we can probably, won't lose that much in the translation here. A number of scholars have mocked the idea that Jewish War and Luke are parallel, but I suspect they have done so only after looking at a summary, which, as stated, would serve to hugely underplay the degree of detail between the stories. By showing the text side by side, and by showing that this is but one small example, I hope the reader will appreciate that Jewish War and the Gospel of Luke definitely do contain deliberate parallels. Throughout this book, I will identify those parallels that I think are particularly interesting or strong by using a red outline, and what follows is the greatest of them all. Before I show the detail that is present in these parallels, it is interesting to observe that they all occur in a small region in Jewish War and a very specific region in Luke, too, as illustrated below. It's barely more than a dot. But as we progress through this book, I will describe more parallels and will keep updating the chart, showing how the APTVS pattern, that's the pattern that is revealed when you go through the whole book of Luke and the whole of the Wars of the Jews. APTVS, it spells Arius Piso Titus Vespasianus, is what I say. I think Atwill has, or I think Meinescotts has a slightly different interpretation. Either way, the mere fact that it forms 5 Latin letters next to each other is pretty clear evidence that it's somebody put them together deliberately. Now, who that was, we'll figure it out, but if we figure they signed their name to it, showing how the APTVS pattern slowly emerges. So let's now look again at that last group of parallels, but in greater detail. Okay, that's the end of the page, and changing pages is a little bit involved, especially here now. He's got it tricked out. Now, I know he's doing this for the benefit of the reader, but it's definitely not helping me, because it's just, it puts it into a format that makes it very hard to read, because it's in 2 columns, and well, we'll see how we do here. Okay, this chart is called the abridged text from the parallel sections in Jewish War and Luke, highlighting specific parallels in various colors. Okay, so we got Jewish War, paragraphs 442, basically through 453, and just for, because I know it's also very difficult to deal with the paragraphs, because a lot of the copies that you might get of Josephus don't have it organized, don't have all the paragraphs numbered like that. I believe, oh boy, I don't have it. I do have it somewhere else, and I believe there's a table in the back of the book. I'll take a look at that, because it's just good to know what. There are 7 books of Josephus, Wars of the Jews, and to know what paragraph each book starts with is useful. So I'll try to get that information. But for now, we're looking at paragraph 442 from Wars of the Jews, 442 to 443. The Jews were everywhere perverted. And so he's saying the text is implying that, in a sense, these Jews were sick. Vespasian was killing them everywhere in the region. So therefore, Vespasian was ethnically cleansing these supposedly perverted people. And also, in a sense, he made them depart. He confronted Jesus. Now, this is a different Jesus. There's actually like 6 or 7 different characters named Jesus in Wars of the Jews, and they all, to a certain extent, mock Jesus, or at least parody the Jesus in the Gospels. He confronted Jesus. This one is known as Jesus Shaphat. He confronted Jesus Shaphat, the head of the robbers. So the robbers were really like what you call the Sicarii, or they're kind of like, not quite terrorists, but kind of like lumpen proletariat maybe, or they were just kind of like maybe they were interested in revolt, and they were Jewish nationalists, and they believed in, if you were a Jew who sided with the Romans, they would rob you, and they were just one of these groups that were a thorn in the side of the Romans. But Josephus calls them robbers also. So Josephus is supposed to be a Jew, keep in mind. According to his autobiography, he's a Jew. He was one of the military leaders who eventually defected to the Romans. But that's very difficult to believe, and it's pretty obvious that he didn't really exist. Okay, and he confronted Jesus Shaphat, head of the robbers, and the city opened their gates, or doors. And they were crying out with joy, calling him their savior. However, Jesus ran away. Another example of being made to depart. And Vespasian restored the city to a quiet state. He made them quiet. Okay, now if we look at Luke chapter 4, verse 40. The sick Judeans came to be healed by Jesus, and devils came crying out, saying, "You are Christ, the Son of God," equivalent to calling him Savior. And he cast out the spirits. He made them depart. And all the city was gathered together at the door, or the gate. Jesus would not allow the demons to speak. He made them quiet. Jesus began saying he was to preach the good news. And I can't see this word. It's the Greek word for evangelistai. Okay, in Greek. That's good news. I think it means good news of military victory, but this might be a different Greek word. So just keep in mind that Greek word is evangelistai. That's for good news or gospel. And this was his purpose. Okay, now if we go back over to Josephus's Wars of the Jews. On arrival, Titus, okay, so Titus is the son of Vespasian. Vespasian was the general for the first 3 years of the Wars of the Jews, but then Nero was killed, and then there was this Roman Civil War that went on for a year where 3 emperors were appointed and were killed or deposed in a short amount of time, and then Vespasian got the call, so he became the emperor. And when he became the emperor, Titus, his son, took over as the general. And eventually Titus became emperor as well. Okay, so on arrival, Titus marched on the shore of Lake Galilee and presented himself to his enemies, and he killed the author of the revolt. So this is implying he killed Jesus. Jesus was the general there, Jesus Shaphat. He was the general. So he killed the author of the revolt. He then sends the good news. He uses that same word, evangelistai, to his father Vespasian. Now, Atwill says, I believe that word actually means good news of military victory, as opposed to just good news. Many Jews escape in small ships, so multiple fishing vessels. Titus begins a naval battle with his forces also in boats, catching enemy fighters on the water. Titus had many men following him on fishing vessels. So implicitly, he sees 2 groups of ships, since he was the commander of one group fighting the other. But his first attack at dawn failed. Titus's ships attacked again, and Jews jumped out of the ships into the water. And using these fishing vessels, the Roman vessels sailed around, so they enclosed many Jewish fishing boats, and many of the boats sank. And Jewish war records that they had killed 6,500. Many Jews ended up swimming for their lives and were caught swimming in the water. And here in 69 AD, Titus's men were catching men out of the water and cutting their heads off, i.e. like fish. And the process, and the previous morning, Titus gave a speech where he urged his men to fear not. And afterwards, they brought their ships to the shore and laid what they had caught there. So they killed the Jews on the beach. At that lake battle, many Jews came, and Titus took many as prisoners and gave some of that which was caught as a gift to Agrippa, who is one of the Herods, the puppet rulers of Palestine, Judea. It is implicit in the battle that the Jews sought to touch him, and all those that came in contact with him were captured. So taking men alive or ethnically cleansed. Okay, now if we go back to the book of Luke, boy, this is a little bit hard to see. Okay, from Luke 5, Luke chapter 5, verse 1. On arrival, he walked on the shore of Lake Galilee, and all this way Jesus showed himself. Jesus saw 2 fishing vessels with 2 brethren making a haul, for they were fishers. They had taken nothing all previous night and had no meat. Then the multitudes followed Jesus. He entered one ship and taught the people out of the ship, The fissures enclosed many fishes, such that both ships began to sink, which is ridiculous. He drew the men to land full of many great fishes. A Jewish disciple fell down at Jesus' feet. He cast himself into the sea. He was swimming, for he was astonished at how many had been taken, as were other Jews. And there at Lake Galilee, Jesus tells that in the future, compared to 30 AD, so perhaps in 69 AD, I would argue maybe 70 AD, At-Rule really shows that the events are shifted by exactly 40 years to the day, many of the events. He would make his men become fishers of men. In the future, he will make his men become fishers of men, which is exactly what Titus does. Titus and his men are fishers of men. In some translations, the phrase is fish for men. In others, teach to catch men. And the Gospel of Marcion phrases it as taking men alive. Jesus said, "Fear not," and they brought their ships to the shore and put the fish there. Now, to put the fish there, I think you have to get a little bit of information from Matthew to get that. Many Jews came to Jesus, or many came to Jesus, and he took and he gave fish that were caught, and then this you have to go to Mark here for this. So as indicated in Mark, around that time, the Jews were continually trying to touch the hem of his garment, and all who did were made perfectly whole. Okay, there's a couple things here that I'd like to point out. That's kind of the end of the parallel. Well, no, I guess it continues on, but before we do that, so he talks about, using the book of Luke and using the Wars of the Jews. But there is the synoptic aspect. Okay, so the book of Luke is one of the synoptic gospels, along with the book of Matthew and the book of Mark. So those are the three synoptic gospels. They're basically the same general story. Most of them have a little bit of uniqueness, but it's pretty much identical trajectory, because they really came from an original one source called Q or Quell. So the synoptic gospels, he groups those together, but then the Wars of the Jews, he kind of says that there's a synoptic set of Wars of the Jews also, and he also includes Antiquities of the Jews, which is written by Josephus in a later period, and it's supposed to go all the way back to the beginning of the Old Testament. It's supposed to be a history going all the way back to the Old Testament. It basically runs parallel with the Old Testament, but it goes all the way up to the first century. It was written later by Josephus. And then also the Slavonic version of Josephus, which is a kind of Russian or Slavic translation that apparently has a few sections in it that are not in the Wars of the Jews, the English Whiston translation. Now, I haven't read the Slavonic version, so when he brings that stuff in, I kind of just have to take him at his word. But the majority of the Decode, though, is from the book of Luke and Wars of the Jews. He just pulls in a few a few things from these other works, and I think that is what Piso or Josephus, what he used in order to kind of hide these things a little bit better. If they were all, because it's kind of like you have to have a little bit of more information that you would have gotten from the book of Mark or that you would have gotten from the book of Matthew in order to kind of complete the conceptual parallel in some cases. So that's just a way that he's using to kind of hide the information enough so that it's not detected. I believe that they intended to be detected eventually, but they kind of wanted to make it through their whole lives before it was detected. They felt like they would become famous if when they were revealed to be the authors. So they wanted to be discovered eventually, but they wanted to make it hard enough so that, it wasn't common knowledge. And as I've said before, many, many, many authors over the years, over the 2000 or 1950 years since they wrote this stuff, many authors have known about it and written about it, but particularly Shakespeare. But also like Tolstoy and Sherlock Holmes, or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and I think Milton's Paradise Lost, C.S. Lewis's works, Tolkien's works. Apparently they all knew this, and they put it in their works, but they couldn't put it explicitly either. And that's when you're talking about Shakespeare, you're talking about every one of his plays. And he is a she, and she is a Jew. Her name was Amelia Bassano. You can look at the works of John Hudson and also Joseph Atwell for that. We'll go into that at a later date. But yeah, so this is not something that has not been known, but it just hasn't been explicitly stated until the work of Abelard Reuchlin in 1979. And since then, it's been stated more explicitly by Joseph Atwill, but also Henry Davis's Creating Christianity. Michael Menescott's here, who is writing this Christianity's Origins, and a few others. So it's not coming out of nowhere. It's been well known because you can see it. You can see it for yourself. Okay, we'll get on with the next set of parallels tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in today. Have a great